Good evening. You're very welcome to tonight's edition of Centre Ground, live streamed every Wednesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. on the Irish Inquiry Facebook page and YouTube channel. And before I begin tonight's programme, I would like to pay tribute to Stephen Kerr from the Irish Inquiry, whose technical skills is making this live stream possible. And there is a lot of work involved, pre-production, and we're asking for people who have videography and editing skills and other skills to go to the Irish Inquiry website, where there's a drop-down bar, Help Us, and you can put in your details there. Tonight's programme puts the spotlight on wills, courts, and how people have lost their homes. I have three guests here to tell us their personal stories of their journey through the Irish courts. And then in the second half of the programme, we'll have a panel discussion. So tonight, my guests are Margaret Hanrahan from County Tipperary, Councillor Frank Roche from County Cork, Mejella Rippington from County Kildare, and our panel discussion tonight is chaired by Dr. Peter Dunne. So to begin, my first guest is Margaret Hanrahan from County Tipperary, and this lady made mainstream news headlines back a number of years ago when she rode her horse all the way from County Tipperary to the gates of Leinster House to highlight her case. Margaret, you're very welcome to Centre Ground.
Thank you.
Margaret, you might begin by telling me how you got into difficulties with the banks.
Well, we go back to 2007, and I borrowed 1.1 million to buy a farm here down Tipperary. Now, I had gone to several banks, and they said, Margaret, your capacity to repay can only be when you sell off your existing assets. But anyway, that didn't work, so we closed down. We said we weren't going to go there. So I met a man from ACC Bank through his sister, and he'd said, I can sort that out. And within 3 or 4 weeks, he did. So his attitude was, I can sell my assets going forward, but I needn't sell them before I get the money. So we drew down the money. Now, to make it very clear, I didn't go to the bank to him. And when we were making the facility, when we were drawing down the money, he came to meet me. He walked every inch of my other farm. He went through all my assets, and he made up what would calculate the repayment on this. So he decided that we would borrow 1.1 million over 2 years, and that my assets at that time would pay the monies that would be due and owing. I think people think that we were reckless borrowers, but that wasn't the question at all. I had calculated exactly what I'd be able to pay back. But when the 2 years came up, there was no talking to the banks. So I employed an agricultural consultant in that 2 years, because I knew that my assets were going to be depleted. They weren't going to make the 1.1 million as the way I saw assets were falling away in 2007. So I got in contact with this agricultural consultant, and he tried to get talks with ACC Bank. But ACC Bank made it very crystal clear, from my own personal experience, they were out to bankrupt me. There was no negotiation, no matter what I offered them. I told them I'd sell the farm, I'd sell my own farm, I'd do anything. I was so desperate, I thought I'd sell myself like a prostitute to just get over this hill. The shame of it, I don't think anybody realizes the shame of it, what this brings, and the torment it brings, because this is the first time in my life at 55 years of age that I got into trouble with banks or anybody else. Had never experienced that in my life. But there was just no talking about it. And see, the old people in ACC at that time were gone, and they had gone back to Robbo, practically, whatever that's out, some foreign country. So they had put in junior guys to take over these loans who knew nothing about talking shop. But their whole attitude was, we will bankrupt you. And that was the end of that story. So,
right. So that was basically what you believe. That's basically what you believed, that they were out to bankrupt you. So absolutely. Tell me about your journey, your marathon journey on a horse from Tipperary to Dublin.
So I decided, what am I going to do? Because I didn't meet anybody that had any trouble with the banks. And if they had, they weren't going to tell me anyway, but mine was public. So how it became public at all was the receiver was put into my farm, and he came in, he ploughed the whole place up. The photographs will show exactly the damage he did. So I said, Jesus, this is ridiculous. How could I have gone from so high to so low, and nobody seems to know how to handle it? So with the help of certain people, they said, Mark, the only way you're going to get out of this is you ride the horse to Dublin. And somewhere along the line, somebody might facilitate you and help you out. And they did, in fairness. I contacted IFA, you can see me there. I contacted different people, and they put me up on the road. But when I got to Dublin, oh my God, did I see the face of Christ, because the people in Dublin, quite a lot of them were all in trouble themselves. So then I could identify with them. I remained in Dublin for 11 years by figuring out what was really wrong. So one of the men in Dublin, after riding that horse, he said, I'm in the same trouble with the same bank. Then somebody else came and said they were in the same trouble with the same bank. So this man and his wife put me up for 4 or 5 years in Dublin. I attended the courts every single day to learn how I would do this, how things were done in the court, what papers you had to get. It's all meticulous. The work is meticulous going into court. You have no business going into court or going anywhere without preparing your defence. You can compare it to 2 boxers. The 2 boxers go in and they're meant to be equal, but they're not. If you one of us a better barrister and you're a lay litigant, you can consider your case over and done with. It's not going to work because you're not able for the legal side of it. There, you're just not. You have no qualifications. You don't understand what's going on. But I get 4 years going up and down to the courts. Stay in Dublin for 4 or 5 nights. Get up every morning, go down to the High Court, follow what was going on, see what was going on, and 99.5% of the cases were being lost at that time.
Okay, so if I could just take you a moment to the receivers moving in on your property, and we're not going to name any company or anybody, but you can speak about your experience of what happened when they moved in.
Oh my God, this was the experience of a lifetime. People think because the COVID is here, it's nothing compared to what I have suffered, what I did suffer. Thank God that suffering is gone today. But they came in with a machine, they broke down the ditches, they ploughed up the farm. They were going to get me out by hook or by crook. The whole thing was to terrify me. I was a widow woman sitting here in Tipperary with no support. But later all that support did come now, in fairness. But their whole idea was to get vacant possession, and they were determined. You couldn't write it. Only the photographs will show the damage they did. And there's no words that can describe what went on here for 13 days. Machinery upon machinery came in here. They cut off my water, they cut off my electricity, because the receiver has all those powers, because it's all contained in your mortgage document. You sell your soul to the bank the day you sign a mortgage, and I don't think people realise that.
Okay, you sell your soul to the bank the day you sign a mortgage. Can we just unpack that a little bit? What do you mean by that, Margaret?
What happens is you go into the bank and they give you a thing called a facility, and you read the facility and you say, yeah, I'm borrowing such a thing over 2 years. But they come along and 3 weeks later and they hand you a document. Now, you will never read this document. This document consists of, mine is 1 to 24 pages, and every clause you could think of is contained in it. And every power the bank wants and every power the receiver wants, without ever going into court, you have signed over all your assets to the bank. You are only a lodger in the bank's property. And until every penny of that money is paid back, I can tell you, you are only a lodger. And Judge Baker made that very clear in the courts. We're all lodgers while we owe money. And if you fail on one clause, and people think you have to go in to get a court order in the courts because to get you out. No, you have given that permission in the mortgage document under clause 8 in mine. The receiver has all powers. He takes control. He can do what he likes. He can literally put you outside the road, which he has done and will do again and again and again. And people don't realise that.
One of the words you used there was shame. Just tell me a little bit about the shame you felt when this happened to you in Tipperary.
You just, no, if I had to die that time, I would have been happy. Or if I had been to a mental home, I'd have been happier. To face the shame, because you ended up with no money, you ended up with no car, you ended up, and you couldn't tell people because nobody would believe you. They all went to, quite a lot of people would say, well, she was reckless, she didn't know what she was doing. I certainly did know what I was doing. I had quite a lot of property, and that property exceeded any money I borrowed. And my accountant had given a very factual evidence and support about how I would repay this money. And she had made it very clear to the bank, unless I could sell the assets would make sure we would repay the loan. Now, normally an auctioneers or anyone that would be given valuation, they'd say it's best to sell the assets first. But the ACC were so desperate to give me the money, they gave me the money first and then told me sell the assets. Now, it was very clear in court, because even one of the judges asked, I wonder how much did the bank manager get? What was his fees that day for giving me that loan? He pushed out the loan so fast. And see, there was no sale of assets at that time, because that was the end of September, and next we were in 2008, I could sell nothing.
That coincided with the property crash that came and the bank collapse and all of that. And so the property that you had, the assets that you had to pay off that loan were completely devalued.
Absolutely. So far, just tell you that we had a thatched house, and under the stewardship of the receiver, that was burnt down. Nobody could ever found for the cause of that. And as a result of that, you'll see that house was burned down. As a result of that, then they came along and threw every single bale of hay I had in. Imagine throwing out bales of hay that you made in the summer and throwing them out in September to rot in the fields. And that was all that I couldn't feed the horses. I could do nothing. So it was all intimidation. And you're talking about the COVID thing. The one thing I'd be concerned, not so much people's health is one thing, but what about the people who have taken a break from the mortgages? They literally are facing the same thing what I faced in 2011. To break your mortgage contract is breaking your contract. So the receiver and the banks can come in now because you have broken your contract, even though the government is saying, oh, we'll look after you. I heard it being discussed in the morning that they're only waiting until January or February for receivers and whatever else is going into hotels and all of this. We are going to have the same tsunami again back come March. I can assure you we'll have the same tsunami. So people wake up. They might be getting free money now, but you will pay for it.
Okay, Margaret, that is a very severe word of warning on which to end our discussion for the moment. I will be coming back to you in the second half of the programme. Margaret, thank you for sharing that. An amazing woman, a hugely resilient woman. Any woman that rides a horse from Tipperary to Dublin is really to be admired. Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm just so taken aback by your story. I have another similar story of somebody who lost their farm. Councillor Frank Roche is my next guest tonight. You're very welcome to Centre Ground, Frank.
Thank you, Anna.
Frank, maybe you might begin by telling me a little bit about growing up on the farm and how you came to be a farmer.
I was born into a family of three. We farmed in Cllr, County Cork, and from a very, very young age, I could probably say from 3 or 4, I was always a little farmer. I absolutely loved out on the farm, working on the farm, and even when I went to school, when I came home from school, the first thing I did was put on my working clothes and went out in the farm and baited cattle. When I was young, that's, if I wasn't driving tractors, but when I got to a drivable age, and I'm not saying a licensable age, but a drivable age, I used to be doing small little jobs at tractors and doing the farm, general farm work on the farm, and I loved it.
And you farmed away then until you were in your late 40s, I believe.
Well, I went to boarding school for 5 years, and when I finished the boarding school, I went to Dara Agricultural College to do a green cert in farming to take over the family farm. Now, when I finished my green cert in farming, I came home farming, and I was farming on the farm then full time. Okay,
so then in 2012, your mum passed away. There was a dispute over ownership of the farm that ended up in the courts, and you ended up losing. You lost your home and you lost your farm. And we won't go into the details of that court case, but what I'd like to chat to you tonight about, Frank, is what was it like to lose your home?
It was absolutely devastating. The morning I went out to the court case, I didn't believe that I was going to be put out of my home. I went into the court, I was put out of home. Now, in fairness, there was nobody, my father did not object to me being in the home. In actual fact, he suggested to the judge that he liked me home because I was coming back. And I tell him,
okay, we won't go into the details of the court case, but just,
oh yes.
Yes, if you just tell me what it was like after the court when you were taken out of the home, when you had to leave.
I left my home in the morning and I was put out by the courts. I never returned to that house afterwards. And the night of the court case, I slept in the car, my car, and I remember waking up at 4 or 5 in the morning and my feet were absolutely numb. I could not feel my toes. And sadly, since that night, I have pains in my knees and my feet. Now, it was the most devastating effect of all times. Homeless, jobless, and practically valueless at that stage.
And that was just a really, really difficult place to be, Frank. But I know that your neighbours rallied around you and that you ran for the council elections in the last elections, and you were elected to Cork County Council. And
That's right.
I know that you were chatting to me yesterday and earlier today, and you were saying you have incredible support from your neighbours.
I had absolutely brilliant support. Everybody in the community came behind me. I was amazed how many people supported me. But what I have discovered since I was elected to the council, it is a never increasing problem in farming. And you have an awful lot of farming families where there's disputes. In actual fact, I have people from all over Ireland. I have people from Sligo, Roscommon, Wexford, Waterford, Kerry, every county. And I would go so far as saying there is almost a farm dispute in every town. And it is very sad that our legal system are fueling a very, very, a very expensive gravy train and costing farming families a small fortune. And they'll make it, there's really a cash cow for our legal system.
And you tell me that some of these farmers that have contacted you from all over Ireland are now quite elderly men, and that they find themselves in really very poor living conditions, but because of the title on the farm and so on, they can't sell a site or dispose of any of the land in order to kind of provide themselves with any kind of a comfortable living in their old age.
That's exactly it. I've come across a case of where there's a farmer, and there was 4 boys in the family and 2 girls. His parents died without a will. One of the boys went away on a job. The 3 boys stayed at home with the family.
We have to be very careful now. We don't identify any family.
Oh no, yeah, he's an Irish farmer, and the girls had gone away in their respective jobs. Now that man is actually homeless like myself. And his problem is he cannot sell a site to build a house or even to buy a log cabin or anything, because the farm is in dispute for over 30 years. And if he goes by the settlement and everything done, he will really have to sell his whole farm before he will have anything for himself.
And what would you like to see happening, Frank?
They will have the farming organisations, the farming advisor, let it be the state or the private, somebody will have to step up to the mark. And I have never heard any of the organisations or the advisory services advising people on the tragedies that are happening in farming families after a death, most likely, where you have brothers and sisters coming back, attacking the family farm and attacking the poor creator that actually stayed at home all his life, minded his elderly parents, lived a very sheltered life, and they are now being attacked by their other siblings to take their assets off them.
And that is a very, very poor outlook. And as you say, there are many organisations to support victims in many walks of life, but there is actually no organisation to support victims like yourself who end up working for the most part of your adult life on a farm to find yourself absolutely homeless, destitute, and with absolutely nothing. Well, listen, Frank, thank you so much for telling us your story, and we'll be back to you later on for the panel discussion. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
My next guest this evening is Mejella Rippington, and Mejella, because of her journey through the Irish courts, has now become an expert lay litigant. And she's here tonight to chat to me about some of the finer points about probate and wills and law. You're very welcome to Centre Ground, Mejella.
Good evening, Anna, and to the guests. Thank you. I don't know if I'm deserving of being expert lay litigant, but I've certainly learned the hard way, and I have come through quite an experience. Unlike other estates, our situation was very simple. We had a double family death in March 2015, and the two family members resided in the family home all of their lives. But what happened after that was quite extraordinary. In the week of the deaths, we were, my family were not in dispute. There was an estate unencumbered with a will, and there was an estate insolvent without a will. And what we couldn't have understood at the time, and nobody could have forewarned us, that law firms could get in and seize property and money without a proper instrument in law that carried validity to do so. And there's quite fine detail there, but suffice to say that. And then we were put into litigation, and then the family were vilified. And once the litigation was set up, where proceedings were instituted to challenge a will, albeit on the wrong grounds, bypassing the probate court, which would have dealt with particular applications, and it's where we should have been directed. And at the time, we put our trust in the law firms, because during that time, even 6 months in after the deaths, it was quite surreal. And
okay, Mejella, can I just cut across you there? And I do apologise. I'm just a little bit, I suppose, erring on the side of caution. I don't want to go into the finer details of court cases, because I'm only putting forward one side of the story, and so that it would leave me wide open to prosecution if I just presented one side of the story. So suffice to say, Mejella, because of your experience of going through the courts, you have become somewhat expert, having observed and then having studied. You've become expert in what happens in these courts. So what would you say to people that are watching here tonight that are in the midst of very costly litigation, or there's a dispute over a will or a dispute over property? What would you have to say to them from your own experience, Mejella?
Well, from my own experience, what I would say is there are two different areas. There are wills with regularity, which are drafted and made under advices, and they go through the strict language and the proper process. And those wills have attestation clauses, and they carry presumption of validity, which is vitally important. Then you have what are the bedside wills, the homemade wills that carry no regularity. They arise perhaps in suspicious circumstances, and they are held up under the same legislation where they don't meet the criteria of the strict language or proper procurement. And where there's a need for inquiry, that inquiry should be there. The probate office themselves, who do not give advices, they strictly, they're there to protect against error and fraud. But there's confusion for people. Once the death occurs, the will becomes valid after death. when you make a will, it's not a valid instrument until such time as you die, because your will can't take legal effect when you're alive. So once you die, your will comes into place. But wills and probates are two separate different things. And what really is at issue, people should certainly consider, talk to your family, discuss, have that conversation before you draft a will. A will is, for many people, a document of necessity, but it is the most dangerous document you could pen your name to. The public are not consulted when there is legislation being proposed. We've had quite a number of pieces of legislation in the last year or so, particularly the a bill on decision-making, assisted decision-making. We have proposed changes which arises out of the estate of my late sisters. I say and believe that on the estate of my late sister, having come through the journey of the courts, having found the malpractice and the failures, having unravelled what has been done by members of the legal sector, and I have the endorsements from the court that there was no doubt. A superior court judge said, I am not doubting there was fraud. Law firms.
Mejella, can I have asked you not to go into that specific legislation, and you have made a statement there that I can't substantiate what the judge said.
It's actually public record in the appeals court, so it's on the record of the courts. And anything I put to you this evening, I put to you from with the utmost, which I hold up to the utmost scrutiny. But I can say to you, anything I say is from historical record, the record of the courts, and it is out there. There was
yes, but Mejella, I'm not expert in anything to do with the law, so I can't stand over what you're saying there myself, because I'm not a legal expert. And so getting back to the question then of wills, and so many court cases arise because of a disputed will. So for people that are looking in tonight, how can they ensure that there will be no dispute over their will when they die?
Well, it's the problem is when you can't really. The best thing to do is to, of course, you have to take legal advices if you want to draft a legal instrument of law. And I would not advocate that they shouldn't go to solicitors. But you have to look at the climate that you will have to deal with the probate and the grants of administration after death. The will and the probate, they are very, very different scenarios, and probate really means legal permission, and there's usually disputes within families as to who should act, who should be the legal representative who will act in the estate. And the families then, I have to say this, that, and I say it without prejudice, but law firms do nothing to prevent disputes. They fuel the disputes. We do not have an ADR process here to deal with what is inevitable. Every family in the state is going to deal with death at some time in their lives. And some people will leave an estate. Not everybody needs a will, because you might have a very small estate, and it's only when there are substantial estates, or even estates that are up to 300,000. It's incredulous to think that if you have an estate, a small estate which is deemed modest at 300,000, all of that estate will be used up in legal costs. And the costs arise out of inordinate delay, out of disproportionality of costs, and a process too called conversion, where families can be kept in a very prolonged legal process where we have not reformed here in this country. We took our law from the UK, as most people will know, and the UK had gifted the world with the common law, and we're working in an adversarial system here in Ireland. Anybody who has to face dealing with probate, they would need to understand the Irish legal system, the common law, the adversarial system, the statutes, the procedural law, the rules of the court. There is such a vast amount that no person has a chance going it alone. and yet we cannot find law firms who will come out, and they can't, and I found out why, because there is a hidden area in the practice of probate. Probate has been a soft touch for a long, long time, going back even into the mid-1800s. And there's a very famous book written, it was a novel by Charles Dickens, which he created a fictional case called Jardinans versus Jardinans. And that goes through many generations of a very wealthy estate, which actually finished up that all the interim orders wasted away that estate. There is, the legislation is not there. It is not robust enough to protect the estates. I had questions raised, parliamentary questions raised, to have Section 4 of the Succession Act amended to protect and preserve. And what is happening, and it's ludicrous, whilst law firms can be appointed, and lawyers particularly, to take out the many variety of grants that exist, grants of representation, Section 8, Part 4, Section 27(8) of the Succession Act provides that that administrator be paid for their services. That is an unlimited figure for any amount of time that is needed. And in our case, we were just observers of what was happening. We had no control, a false narrative created in the courts. And
I asked you, Mejella, not to.
But it is the legal, it is the history of what has happened. And now what we understand, and it has been put to me by law firms, we would not have known at the time that how easy it was to set us up for costs.
Can I just say, and I will just finish it up there now, Mejella, because I did ask that we wouldn't go into specific law cases, and that will be a subject for another program. But really, the message of what I've taken up from what you have been saying this evening is that families that go into dispute or find themselves in dispute over a will, it goes into court and it goes round and round over a long period of time until the value of the estate gets used up. So
I should clarify, just on that point, there's a very clear distinction, and not to be confused. There are two different jurisdictions. There is what's called contentious probate and non-contentious probate. Contentious probate is dealt with in the High Court or maybe in the Circuit Court, depending on the value of the estate. But the non-contentious is dealt with in the probate court, because the probate court is an extension of the probate office. It is a surrogate court under the auspices of the High Court. You are not having a cause of action in there. You have matters that are not probate actionable. And that process, and this is an absolute record, that process, and I have witnessed for myself, and I can only tell you from my journey, I have watched estates, our own estate.
I know, sorry, we won't, we'll just speak in general terms, please.
No, right, just let me give you a picture, because the costs are 210,000 to deal with an insolvent estate in the probate court. That is fact. I witnessed other estates costing up to 50,000, another estate was 70,000, and another estate was 100,000 in the administrative process before any lawsuit takes place. Now, that is a matter of record, and I would not put it to you this evening if I didn't know that to be the case. I did my own research. I attended the courts every Monday in probate, because when we first went into this situation, we were at ground zero, we were at naught. I knew nothing about the complexities of probate. You could go a lifetime and be constantly learning. What I have taken from it is I have turned that around. I had to become better informed myself, and I did so by attending the courts, notating the decisions of the judges, notating the various cases and the various applications. And then I took advices and got from experts who wrote the books, the authors and the authorities. Yes. And when I did all of that research, I can sit here tonight with hand on my heart and tell you that there is a very clear track and trace of what is going wrong in the handling of the administration of estates. And it's not until you go through it that you discover what nobody would And I'm very willing to tell people now what my journey was like, what has happened. Now, it's not for this evening. It is a very, very in-depth journey.
Yes.
But
okay, and for that now, Mejella, I am deeply, deeply grateful for you for coming on this evening. I think we have got a very, very clear idea that from your own personal experience of going through the courts and sitting in on other court cases, you have learned where the system is going wrong. It's very, very, very costly. And I suppose the bottom line is that when people are making their will, they must, I suppose, ensure that they frame it in such a way that it is not open to any litigation after they die, because if that happens, there is a strong possibility that the entire value of the estate will actually be used up in costs in court. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mejella. Thank you. And now this takes us to the second part of our programme. And tonight our panel discussion is chaired by Dr. Peter Dunne. You're very welcome back to Centre Ground, Peter.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thank you to Stephen. Certainly a lot to unpack there before we get into the hot topic of the week. Just some observations, Anna, and I think there's a lot of it resonates very much with this week's hot topic and indeed what we're all going through at the moment. An interesting point, actually, listening to all of those harrowing stories, and it struck me as I listened to Margaret there, that the word mortgage is actually the anglicised version of the French word mortgage, which means death grip. So I think when you actually realise that, some of the shenanigans and some of the behaviour and the way that played out perhaps isn't surprising. Two things I think that you mentioned there as well, Anna, that we need to see both sides of a debate. And that's very pertinent in terms of this week's hot topic. And also from what Mejella and indeed what all of our guests this week were saying, it strikes me that the legal system really operates on a number of, I suppose, pillars. We can speculate, but does the lack of knowledge of the litigant factor into it in a big way? And does that lack of knowledge create fear and intimidation? And I think it resonates very much with the COVID-19 debacle and crisis that we find ourselves in at the moment, where the general public, on the one hand, lack knowledge for myriad reasons, and that very lack of knowledge creates fear. So I think that is very pertinent at the moment. And it brings us to this week's hot topic. And it relates to COVID-19 and to the announcement of lockdown level 5. And our question this week is, should we be in lockdown level 5 for 6 weeks? And then are there viable alternatives that are available to us, such as the strategy of focused protection that's advocated, for example, by the Great Barrington Declaration, which was recently declared, and which, according to one of the co-signatories of that declaration, Professor Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University, that this strategy of focused protection was actually in most European countries, bearing in mind he is Swedish, it was until recently the standard response of European health authorities. So that's one interesting thing I think we need to bear in mind. There are a number of, I think, issues which kind of come together in the COVID crisis. Two of them being, I think, the intrusion of the profit motive on the interpretation and the practice of science, and the fact that scientists should be driven by the search for truth. And if I could just give a shout out to Ivor Cummins. Ivor has made a comment on a number of threads where we really have to be true to the technical data. Now, there is a little bit of scope for some variance in interpretation of the data, but you get to a point where where if data is interpreted in a completely inaccurate way, you really have to question that on a number of fronts. Can you put that down merely to incompetence? And we also have the issue of the conflation of science with politics, because what is politics and what is science? They're very different creatures. So politics is about psychology. Politics is about priorities, and it doesn't necessarily always concern itself with objective facts and truth, or indeed evidence. And in stark contrast to that, what the science actually do, or at least we try to do it, we concern ourselves with objective facts, with some scope for interpretation. But what it isn't, or what it shouldn't be, is dogmatic and a kind of a quasi-religiosity or based on blind and absolute faith. It's based on evidence, and evidence can change. And when that evidence changes, we need to adapt our interpretation and adapt our response. So science isn't set in stone, it's fluid, it changes. It has that capacity to change. So in relation to COVID-19, for example, and specifically in relation to lockdown, we need to adapt our response, one could say, to the evidence that's before us. And one of the best examples for that is that Peru had the strictest lockdown in early 2020, and yet it recorded the highest death rate from COVID on the planet. So really, I want to frame tonight's discussion by means of a number of questions, really to get people to think, and just to try and tease out those issues. And the first question I would pose is that, has the response to the virus been deadlier than the virus itself? So did policy create a sort of a perfect storm, particularly in relation to the long-term care facilities? And therefore, is the real issue that we're seeing, or that indeed we saw play out, and hopefully we won't see play out again, is it chronic underinvestment in the public healthcare system for decades, which has been amplified by changes in family structure and social changes over the last probably 4 or 5 decades? The other issue with lockdown is, if it's to continue, and if, assuming the state provides a safety net and continues to do so, that the state will incur debt. And where does that debt come from? And then who ends up paying for it, and over what time frame? And what are the implications over the short, medium and long term? Very important to consider. And whenever money is involved, we always have to say, follow the money. And people will then, I suppose, naturally enough say who benefits. But in discussions since all of this began, people have said that to me, and I always say to them, I'll flip that around and say, well, who's actually losing? Who's being damaged? Who's being harmed the most by this? Because if we actually ask that question and then try to answer that, maybe we can kind of peel back the veneer and see what might be really happening.
Okay. You've thrown out 3 questions there, Peter, 3 in 1. So maybe if we could deal with them maybe one at a time. And I'm looking here. The first question really centers on whether or not the cure, which is lockdown, is it worse than the actual disease itself? So, Margaret, what's your view on the lockdown?
Well, my view is that the fear is going to kill the person, because they don't know whether they're right or wrong, and they're like running like hares into a den. And looking at the COVID thing, where I'm just looking here, what the government are saying, well, we'll protect the people, we'll give them the few bob to keep going. But what's going to really happen when those people hit mortgage crisis? I fear that fear itself will kill them, because they won't be able to handle it.
And yes, I suppose you're picking up there on a point that you made earlier, being that come next year, people will realise for the first time that their mortgage, that they have entered into a different territory with their mortgage. Just, can you go back on that point again, Margaret?
See, people don't realise you can only have two behind payments. And once those behind payments are broken, your contract is broken. All your powers that you had are all ceased. The mortgage holder, now being the receiver, being the bank, have total control of you. They can tell you when to go and when to not go. And nobody is bringing that out. I'm just making notes here. The safety net, my back. what safety net will be there when those mortgage holders, those young people, and we needn't talk about my age group because it doesn't matter to me, 64, what to do to me. But those people that can never handle any bit of trouble in their lives, they'll pray for debt because there's nothing worse than it. And it was just, you asked the question there, what was the worst thing that could happen to someone? It's not being believed that someone could wind you up and put you into a state like that, much like the COVID thing. Wouldn't it be better to say I died from the COVID, that killed me, than the bank killed me? If you look at the last census from the IFA, it was written, I'm not making this up, it was written in the Farmers' Journal there a few weeks ago, that I think they nearly said half the land of Ireland is owned by a vulture. Could you imagine, is it COVID's worrying those farmers tonight, or is it the bank is worrying those farmers? I'd say it is the bank.
That's a very interesting point. That is a really interesting point, that I suppose the biggest threat that is facing people is actually the threat of repossession or court cases rather than the threat of the virus. That's what's really worrying them. Frank, could I bring you in, please?
Yes.
What are your views on lockdown? Hello, Frank.
No medical background. Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. Frank, I can hear you. What's your view?
I've no medical background, and I would be fearful of the virus. But having said that, I think it will have an awful mental effect on a lot of the old and the vulnerable. And there's an awful lot of people in the road and out in rural areas, and the 5 kilometre radius is very unfair on them. And where people used to go to the local restaurant, the local and an awful lot of the elderly and the more vulnerable people.
Right. And Mejella, what are your views on the government introducing stage 5 lockdown for 6 weeks?
Well, I'm actually think it shouldn't be happening. To answer the question, I do think that the remedy now is more deadly than the COVID. When we first went into lockdown, this was new to us. We knew we had this invisible enemy that was somewhere out there, and we just all had to observe certain practices and suppress it. But now we see this week that we are only going into what was adequately described as the yo-yo situation, suppress it, and there's nothing on the horizon to say that there's a vaccination. Like, not that I'm skeptical about the vaccinations, but we're told on one hand that there are certain medications that have good effect, and we now have perhaps in a better place that we understand this COVID. I don't believe we understand it. Whatever COVID is, whether it is a respiratory virus, we have people who get it mildly and others who are getting what we're now calling the long COVID. I think the public out there are not convinced. I happen to have had a lot of time in the city lately, and I see people who are really, it's as if COVID doesn't exist. And not that I blame them for it. They have nothing to benchmark it against. They have nothing to give them confidence that, look, the government didn't come out. They've mishandled this from the start because they didn't know enough about it. And they haven't been able to go to the people to say, we're going to find a way to really live beside this until such time as we really know what it is. And we're listening to virologists and we're listening to economists. The other night I felt, when I saw what was happening and the news breaking out, and we now know that, and we always understood, we did not invest in the healthcare system. The healthcare system isn't there to support. We don't have the ICU beds. And nobody has mentioned, and I'm just wondering, where will the ICU beds be for the people who are in the front line, the carers and the nurses and the doctors who might need it? Have they put ICU beds aside from them? I don't think we're getting the full facts. And we know that governments don't always tell us the full facts. They lie, and the authorities lie, and they cover up. And unless the people can trust the government, trust the information they're giving them, they're not going to buy into any remedy or any protections. And I think this time around, coming so close to Christmas, shutting down businesses, I felt for the restaurants recently. I was in Sandymount, and the restaurants, every time they get kicked, they get back up, they find another way, they invest, they buy outdoor equipment, outdoor coverings, and they're just being told, we're just going to shut you down again. So the country has just become powerless. There was a time, if you remember, we couldn't have an extra day off at Christmas. We had to stay commercially viable, we had to stay open, and now we can close down for weeks on end. Where is this money coming from? Who's backing it? Will it take the collateral and the assets of the Irish state to back this money? You just can't print money. Money has to be come from somewhere. And maybe there is some truth in the conspirators who are saying that there'll be a debt reset in years to come, and maybe there's something else happening. So I really think that we are very much in the dark, and until we have a more honest approach, the public aren't going to buy into it. And yes, I'm more fearful now and panicked about it because of what I found more frightening was the fact that there's no end in sight, and that's on the never. For me, that's what I see.
Okay, so Peter, just to go back to you there and pick up on the point that Mejella touched on, and that you raised, the second question that you raised. The government is running a budget deficit in 2021 of 20 billion. And you asked the question, who is going to pay?
Absolutely, Anna. I mean, just to come back on one or two points that Mejella raised, which really dovetail with some of the commentary that we're seeing today, where, for example, former Justice Minister and Attorney General Michael McDowell had a piece, I think it was today, I think it was in today's Independent, where he's questioning the price of following the NPHET advice, and he's actually calling for more transparency from NPHET, and that we need to actually see the basis upon which those decisions are made. And similarly, I saw a comment on Twitter earlier today from David McWilliams, no less, and he was saying that, well, two things really. He was saying that we needed more female representation on the NPHET panel and the committee, and also observing that most of those on the committee were either, to use my phrase rather than his, lifers in academia and the university sector, or in the corporate sector, and that they couldn't really empathise and didn't understand with the effects of lockdown and various other similar countermeasures on SMEs and how they were going to, completely destroy the economy. And just looking at data from ISME actually replied to David, and it's actually quite staggering when you realise some of the raw figures which speak for themselves, that the SME sector provides 62% of private sector earnings and in excess of half of the income tax, USC, even more of PRSI. And if you look at the level of employment, 74%, that's 3/4 of employment in what they've called the productive sector, which I can presume is the private sector. So those figures are quite staggering, and I think they don't bode very well for 2021, because bear in mind, after all, that the productive sector is the sector that generates the wealth, which pays for the public sector, which includes, for example, health and education. So I think, we could be in very, very choppy economic waters. Just to come back to another question which I had, and it again dovetails with what David McWilliams and Michael McDowell are saying, is it time that we either disbanded NPHET, or can we maybe broaden their expertise so that they can kind of include some people who have some level of expertise? And I'm not saying it's a solution, but and it may be only a sticking plaster, but that at least that they can have some appreciation of the effects that countermeasures have on the economy and therefore on society, where they can appreciate the fact that in actual fact the cure may be worse than the disease, and to use not to be glib, but to use a phrase, we may be using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Okay, so to come back with you, Margaret, do you have any views or opinions on NPHET?
Well, I suppose we have to go by the experts, and we have to take care of ourselves. We have to be really careful of the older people, and I'm including myself in that. And I have to respect what's going on because I don't know the difference. And hopefully that we are being told the truth, even though lots of people tell us we might be told. But all I can do right now is look after myself and look after anyone around me and be responsible for myself. And if that means not going out and shopping sensibly, I'm going to do that and take the risk for the next 6 weeks that I don't get it, nor I don't give it to anybody else. That would be my one wish. And that people wouldn't spend what they're being told to spend. That no way would I be telling people to spend. They don't know what's going to hit them in January and February. There's no words that can describe it. There's going to be desperation. Desperation. And that's all I could say. But please, please, mind yourself and mind each other.
Okay. And Frank, what are your views on NPHET?
I would echo on Margaret's theory, and what I am myself, I'll be fine. But what I am concerned about is the vulnerable and the elderly people in rural Ireland, and it's the mental effect that worries me most. And coming into the short days and the short evenings, where people in the summertime we were going to daylight, but this time of year we're coming to a certain time of the year, and I would be very, very concerned for the mental health of the vulnerable in our society.
Okay, thank you for that, Frank. And Mejella, what are your views on NPHET?
My views on NPHET are NPHET are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Firstly, they are not a political body. It is not their job to worry about the politics of the country. They are going to put out the worst case and panic, if it's to call panic, or put fright into the people, because this virus is, we have no vaccination for it, and because this virus is, if it's as deadly as they say, and we have to respect the advices of those persons, and we must, what we should be trying to do to get across the message, we have to follow best practice. But I don't believe that best practice is being followed widely enough by all of the population. All of the population have to be on board. And if they're on board, then they can sidestep this virus as best as they can until such time as this virus, we overpower the virus. At the moment, the virus is in charge of us. So NPHET are doing what NPHET are supposed to be doing, but then we have the power play in the middle and the politics. And I have no confidence in our government. I have no confidence in either of the two parties. And I think the political power and wrangling will always take precedent over the good of the people. And we have seen it time and time again. I have no more decades left for the various politicians to just practice what they're doing. We probably need a national government at this stage to manage our country. We are only 5 million people. We are not 55 million people, and we can't seem to manage our health service. We need experts in health, experts in finance. Those experts are out there, and they are the persons who should be running those parts of our country. We're only managing, we're an island. We're an island. We didn't have to have COVID on our island to the extent that it was. And you heard the case the other day where one person came back, if what they're telling us is accurate, 56 people infected because that person could not follow the procedures of isolating. We're not following best practice. And until we follow best practice is our only hope at the moment until we know what we're dealing with. So we have to try and find the perfect balance. And how do you find the perfect balance? And you certainly won't find it when the parties are pulling at one another for a struggle for power in what is a very dangerous situation in our country. Pandemics, this isn't the first pandemic. Pandemics are out there. Governments know how to deal with them, and we're buying into a lot of false information, and we're not getting together as a collective nation to say the nation is going to have to come out now and pull together and put best practice in place. That's what I think.
Okay, so the clock has beaten us, so back to you, Peter, now to just bring all of that together and to bring it to a conclusion, please.
Well, thanks very much, Anna, and thanks for all those wonderful contributions from our guests this evening. I suppose if I could say that the sense that I'm getting from Mejella, from Frank, and from Margaret is a sort of a lingering sense of doubt, and as I've said earlier on, from lack of knowledge, and from a lack of knowledge stems fear. So I think everyone is still a little bit, all of our panelists are a little bit afraid, and I think that harkens back to what I think we can all agree is a lack of balance in the mainstream media. And I suppose in as much as we are an alternative media platform, we can at least attempt to try to redress that balance and address those challenges, because challenges they are. There seems to be, I think, a narrative of fear, as Mejella has said. And I mean, for example, anybody who doesn't completely support the agenda, and we only have to look at the case of Dr. Martin Feely, who lost his job for just making up what I felt were some quite reasonable points. So that there's certainly, I think, a lack of balance, and I think that needs to be repivoted back to the centre ground, really. And I think we need more honest discussion from both sides, and we need to have experts of the caliber of the people who have signed the Great Barrington Declaration, and also, for example, Professor John Ioannidis from Harvard University. And today I looked at his paper, which has actually been adopted by the World Health Organization. And in fact, if I can recall correctly, in the over 70s, which are the high risk group, the infection fatality rate, that's the number of people who are infected but who become ill, that's 0.13%. And I think what we need to do very, very much so for people is to communicate that, what a case is, that a case isn't necessarily somebody who is ill, and a case isn't necessarily somebody from whom you can catch the virus. And this all goes back to the particular test that's used to detect the virus, called a PCR. Just to clarify, my doctorate is a PhD, so I'm not a medical doctor, but I do have a PhD in sort of 20 years of experience in the biological and life sciences field. So I can kind of state that with some confidence. But I think we need a rebalancing and just a recalibration of the message. And hopefully we've done a little bit, at least, to redress that balance here this evening.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that. To those of you who have been watching in this evening, I want to thank you most sincerely. We are really depending on you to share this material, to kind of get the word out there. I'm sure you would agree that the 3 stories that we heard this evening, 3 personal stories from Margaret, from Frank, and from Mejella, very, very harrowing. But I suppose the really wonderful thing about their stories, yes, they have been through a very, very difficult time, but they are 3 amazing, resilient people who are now using their experience to reach out and to help others. I'd like to thank Dr. Peter Dunne for chairing our panel discussion. And finally, a special word of thanks to Stephen Cllr. And as I said at the beginning of the programme, Stephen puts a huge amount of work in pre-production to get this live stream out. And he tomorrow night, a new programme is taking place. It goes out live at 10 o'clock tomorrow night, and it will be presented by Dr. Finbar Markey. That's 10 o'clock tomorrow night, a live stream with Dr. Finbar Markey, and his programme is called Double Down. So that's going to be double work for Stephen. If you have any skills in the area of videography, editing, or any kind of technical skills, if you could volunteer them to us, go to the Irish Inquiry website. There is a tab there, Help Us, and you can enter the details and get in contact with Stephen. So until we meet again next Wednesday evening, live at 8 p.m. Have a wonderful week and Bannock Day Arif Cllr.
Vermont.